So our second webinar is designed to give us the opportunity to have some difficult conversations. And we came about developing this webinar because we want to be able to incorporate the unique experiences of underrepresented faculty as they make their way through academic family medicine. And we know that part of the reason they are quote unquote underrepresented is because of the inequities, the longstanding inequities that have existed not only in our country in terms of race and race relations and equality, but also specifically in the field of academic medicine. So we really tried to hone in on what might be some of the difficult conversations that might need to happen between mentors and mentees. So our objectives today are to help identify a common language that will help us to grapple with some of these conversations, to describe some difficult encounters that we all need to be aware that our mentees may experience as far as bias, stereotyping, racism, different kinds of experiences that really hold them back and hinder them from progressing. Also, within our own selves, we all need to be able to focus on what are the things that we should be working on to address stereotyping and racism. And, you know, part of it, some of it is a personal process of our own personal experience. And then for those of us who are not of a minority culture, who haven't experienced it directly, what do you need to do to be able to connect with your mentees on those types of issues? And then to be able to try and come up with some skills and tactics for mentees to be able to get through these difficult moments. Sometimes that means confrontation, sometimes that means dealing with it internally or both. So we'll be brainstorming, sharing some of the things we've found in our research, and definitely staying open to suggestions from you all. So some of our goals today, we sort of broke it down between addressing the challenges that our mentees go through and also what you as a mentor will possibly experience on this project working with someone from URM background. So we know that there's all kinds of kind of negativity, judgment, rejection, that leads to disillusionment, and that's from being judged and stereotyped, basically. We know that oftentimes people are fighting against this feeling of self-doubt. You know, when the world tells you are not as good, sometimes you grapple with believing that. And so we want to be able to prepare them for any roadblocks that might come along and how they could learn some skills to be able to address and deal with racism and bias in their environment. We also want to be able to tap into the positive things and the powerful things inside them and to really build on that power and to empower them. We know that faculty from URM background are just as skilled and talented as others, and we want to be able to help them to tap into that. And then with the mentor challenges, you know, those of us who are of URM background, what have we done to be able to deal with these issues and overcome some of these challenges? And how does that play out in our work with our mentees? And so on a positive note, we can identify with them. At the same time, we don't want to project our experiences on them. So we need to be able to remain open. How can we support mentees, you know, whether your mentee is of a similar racial background or you're of a different racial background, and how does that look when grappling with these types of issues? And how is that different if you are different of different racial backgrounds? You know, just like in any other mentorship experience, there'll be times when you have to give your mentees difficult feedback, and what is that going to look like? And how do you take into account the things that they experience as a URM faculty member, but also not shy away from giving them that difficult feedback when they need it? And also, we want you to be really open to receiving that feedback from your residents, from your mentees. And most of the time, a lot of times you're going to get, I think, wonderful, lovely, glowing feedback. And at the same time, want you to be able to create that atmosphere where your mentee feels comfortable giving you that feedback, be it positive or constructive. Okay, so I'll turn this one over to Syeachia.
So we just wanted to make sure that we are kind of starting out with the same kind of framework of understanding the different things that are impacting your mentees. And a part of that is really understanding racism. And we think Dr. Kamara Jones, who's also a family physician and epidemiologist, did a great thing by kind of really, breaking it down into the 3 levels of racism. And, the first being individual or interpersonal racism, right? So those acts of bias, whether implicit or explicit, that occur between 2 people or individual at the individual level. So those could be, microaggressions or feeling like, some person is not as competent as they could be because of their race, or those type of feelings that are driven by individual level bias. And then there are those institutional structures that propagate racism. So those, policies that perpetrate racial inequity, maintain the power structures and white privilege. And, when you're thinking about that level, really thinking about some of those policies, those processes within our departments, our institutions that are kind of really driving inequality within our department. So when you think about different promotion qualifications, right? So, research, scholarship, who's going to be more involved in different activities or have more time able to devote to particular activities versus other people. And so sometimes your BIPOC mentees may have more challenges meeting some of those promotion criteria than other faculty, just by the nature of the activities that they're involved in. And so, how do you help your mentee navigate those institutional policies that propagate racism? How do you advocate to change those structures also, and help them to advocate to change those structures within their institution? Next slide.
Yes, and actually, I just one thing I wanted to mention. I'm going to be going between my mute button. I did want to mention, I always forget to do this at the beginning, but my experience is that when you're recording a presentation, I think it's better when everybody has themselves muted. I think that makes for a better sound quality. So I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that to everyone at the beginning.
Yeah, and I missed the sort of internalized racism piece, which, really is when you're thinking about how your mentee as a BIPOC person may have internalized some of those ideas about themselves as minoritized populations within the United States, whether that be feeling less competent than their peers, feeling less able to voice their opinions than their peers, as not wanting to come off aggressive or come off as not collegial within the institution. They may internalize some of these thoughts or ideas about themselves that then also inhibit their ability to be successful in the academic environment. So this is just kind of a brief list of some common language that we want to develop. There are lots of glossaries online that you can Google to really find out, to really get a full comprehensive look at language around anti-racism, around bias, and that you may want to take a look at as you're kind of taking a deep dive into this. But obviously, we want to make sure that we all have a common understanding that race is a social construct without a genetic or biological basis, really a cultural, societal way to perpetuate division and advantage for one group over another group. We always want to have that goal of dismantling systemic racism, really all forms of racism, but especially systemic racism, as it is really the infrastructure that propagates some of these inequalities that are impacting all of us, and especially will have an impact on your mentees in the future. BIPOC or people of color. So really an umbrella term to encompass Black, Indigenous, people of color, really kind of separating out Black and Indigenous as a group of people who have really traditionally been unequally or really systemically marginalized within society and have had really higher impacts related to racism and systemic oppression. Tone policing, where you have your statements dismissed due to, accompanying emotion, right? So someone is angry because they feel ignored or they feel like their voice is not being heard, but instead of addressing the fact that maybe that person is being ignored or they're not given a voice, we focus on the fact that they have anger or the fact that they're emotional in response to that particular insult. White privilege, so advantage, protection, benefit from societal mistreatment, white fragility, discomfort when confronted with information around racial injustice, and we already talked about systemic racism. So really on the topic of race, we want all of our mentors to address race intentionally with their mentees. And, obviously for some of our white mentors, this may be something that you may not have addressed typically with your mentees in the past or your advisees. So it may feel a little bit more uncomfortable and you may have to do some work. And that's part of what we're doing here today in this webinar is really finding the language, the strategies, the kind of framework to kind of build your everyone's comfort level with talking about race and talking about its impact on faculty of color within our institutions and within their institution. And so we really have sought to have an intentionally diverse mentor group because, first of all, there's not, enough BIPOC mentors for every BIPOC person who needs a mentee. And we don't really want to burden all mid-career, late career BIPOC faculty with having to provide mentorship for every BIPOC mentee that needs it, right? So everybody, this should be a shared group for everyone, regardless of your background. And we want to make sure that we're not unequally taxing BIPOC faculty with the role of mentoring those who are younger than them. And we want to make sure that, we're increasing access to power and resources that some of our white faculty may have, disproportionately may hold over other faculty. And that way, by creating those relationships, those connections, you actually are offering the mentee access to some of those resources and power and offering the opportunity to kind of see how to use some of those resources and power in order to be successful themselves. So, the challenge is we want to make sure or help our white mentors create a space for their mentees where they feel like they can discuss this particular challenge of racism and oppression that may be impacting them within their institution. Not all mentees are going to want to discuss this with you. This may not be top of mind or top of a space where they want to have these discussions, but we certainly want to make sure that our mentors feel comfortable having these conversations. They have the language, they have the tools, they have a baseline understanding that these are going to be some of the factors that are impacting their mentees' ability to be successful and stay in the academic environment, which, can be very stressful and challenging, especially in these times.
Thanks, Syeachia, for so clearly articulating some of our thoughts and ideas, which, we've really tried to evolve in how we address this. And we realize we can't just throw people together and say, hey, everybody talk about racism. So we try to be intentional about it. And as Syeachia mentioned, not all of your mentees will necessarily need or want to do this, However, I think it is important to be able to listen for that invitation to talk about it and to be able to express those feelings, which are difficult to express in the best of circumstances. And then when you are a BIPOC person and talking to a white person who hasn't necessarily experienced it, that can be difficult. So at least to listen for those openings and to be open to being able to support your mentee around these types of issues. So continuing in the discussion about talking about race and racism, I think it's really important for us to address the notion of microaggressions a bit. And I think I would venture to say that everyone on this call is familiar with the concept of microaggressions and has had some kind of presentation or done some reading or something about it. And we love these are Jess's words. Unfortunately, Jess wasn't able to join us at the last minute due to some coverage issues. But so she chopped up this phrase, the lifting the weight of a ton of feathers or death by 1,000 cuts. And it's so symbolic because it's just little things that are said or implied, little things that are nuanced that are usually not malintentioned, but can definitely have a negative effect because it causes you to stop and think, so the examples you see, I don't see you as really Black, you're good with numbers, right? Like as though that person is saying, you're really okay with me. And then the question is, okay, would I not be okay if you really saw me as Black? So, to when you've experienced this, you have a heightened sensitivity about it. For white mentors who haven't necessarily experienced it, to be able to be open to having your mentees bring these types of topics up. So we just think it's important to address this in this particular presentation. So they're brief, slight, everyday insults, well-intentioned people they're unaware of hidden messages that can really affect the person the way they're experienced. So how do you interrupt the microaggressions? Well, it's about addressing them. Sometimes it will be just a subtle way of addressing them, but sort of addressing them and challenging them. So highlight the transgression, say back what was said, ask for more information, play dumb to challenge the stereotype. So, so you mentioned, gosh, this is what you think of when you think of a Latina faculty member. This is what you think of. And tell me a little bit more about that. What did you mean exactly when you said, oh, you think I'm going to have this particular characteristic and so on? And just kind of subtly confront and challenge. And, I kind of like that notion of playing dumb. So it's not like a hard confrontation. It's more like, I'm not really sure what you're trying to get at here. And hopefully that will have the person to think about it a little more. So really try to appeal to their sense of empathy, express your feelings, kind of share a little bit about what is going on, and try and appeal to their values and principles. And I'd like to think most of the time people don't necessarily mean these microaggressions. It just comes off that way. And I think we're all guilty of it in some ways. And I can think of the blunders that I've made around my colleagues who are of a different ethnic background than mine, and sort of wish, I'd like to rewind that kind of thing. So feel comfortable if you can, just addressing and challenging and kind of talking through things a bit. So some other tips for conversations about racism, and particularly in the discordant pairs, we want you to be able to lean into that discomfort. We all make blunders and transgressions, and hopefully those mistakes can become a transparent, kind of open above board learning session. Be aware of privilege and how it presents itself in conversation, and be aware of when there are times to, quote unquote, step back a little bit, when perhaps your privilege is getting the better of you and you are being more overtly speaking out, perhaps silencing others or making others feel less comfortable speaking out, that kind of thing. Just sort of that self-check. Be able to validate their experiences. And as I mentioned, the microaggressions, I just think it's really important for us to be able to talk about it today and to start raising awareness. And, to be able to ask about, gosh, has this happened to you before? What was that like for you the last time? That kind of thing. listen for an invitation, as I've mentioned a couple of times, to discuss these types of experiences. And just remember, it's not up to you to fix the problem. You know, you don't have to go into any kind of a long either apology or lecture or anything like that. Not up to you to try and fix the problem, but just really listen and be open-minded. So for all mentors, to be able to self-reflect and identify those emotions that you're experiencing, make sure that you're not over-identifying, that you're not imposing your own experience on the mentees, but really listen to them. Practice empathy, put yourself in their situation. Also to be able to look at the experiences through the lens of intersectionality. So I have all kinds of ways of describing myself. Black Jamaican American woman. I also happen to be an immigrant, came to this country myself at the age of 13, and you know, have certain emotional feelings when we talk about immigrants in this country. So be aware of all our, and you all have different intersecting identities, so to be aware of that. And again, I'm just using Jess's words. She's a lovely way with words, but she talks about recognizing your mentee is an expert on their own experience and their own resiliency. And so you're not running in there to save them, but basically creating that space for them to process and build upon their coping strategies. So I know there's a lot of information on this slide. It's really important. I'm going to try and be as brief as I can in talking about it, but we had everybody do a pre-reflection exercise where you looked at your social identity profile and to look at how have your personal characteristics helped or hurt you in your efforts to achieve in academic medicine. And so I have a compilation here, including comments from last year's group and also incorporated some comments from this year's groups. And again, in the interest of time, just going to move a little bit quickly on this. But so we have some mentors who talked about how their white privilege helped them open doors. They didn't have to worry about rejection. They didn't have to worry about expressing themselves in a certain way or being too loud or being too vocal. They knew that they could be able to have conversations with a group of people in a room and nobody was judging them and tone policing them and that kind of thing. Those of upper middle class background acknowledged that they knew something about education, the whole education process. And many URM folks coming in and they're first generation folks and don't have a legacy of education behind them. Social identity as a white female is one of privilege. Some people who are URM or BIPOC, the positives of that is developing the resiliency. And, you know, along this way, having been doing this work for for so long, I know I have benefited from that. And being that I have identified myself as somebody who wants to address these issues, I think people are less likely to challenge me or stereotype me. So I am aware I have a little bit of sense of privilege because of how long I've been doing this. Sometimes people benefit from being the model minority. This is what we expect from you. And I know you're going to be good because you're so-and-so. That in and of itself can be a microaggression, even though it does open doors. But again, just a sense of benefiting from that. Also, you know, those of us within the minority community, there are different things, lighter skin tone. We know that people judge you based on skin tone in this society. And how does that help and give privilege? Certain characteristics are a benefit where the stereotype is positive. We talked about that a little bit. And then also the other, again, that issue of those of us who've been doing this for a while and actually get the opportunity to attend the diversity training, and that gives us a bit of a leg up. So, you know, in terms of how it's hurt you, lots of experiences with stereotyping, you know, anti-Semitism, being tone policed, having that extra burden of what we call the minority tax of having to do so much work but based on what your cultural ethnic background is, being underestimated and dismissed, being judged as being submissive or mild-mannered and being passed over, that kind of thing. Also comments, assumptions about religious background based on your personal characteristics and different things. Some people had their ideas taken over by others who, you know, you look at me, you don't necessarily think I would have come at that, but you might look at my white colleague and say, hey, great idea, that kind of thing. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to George.
Okay, so tactics to combat implicit bias. There's an EPIC model that we've sort of borrowed and used in one of our toolkits. I guess the first piece of that is engaging in perspective taking. It's very hard for me to, in some ways, think about what other people's perspective is, but actually admit my own perspective and acknowledge it. And so some of it is that reflection of like, how am I approaching this, and what am I thinking, and how am I to be similar or different to the other ways that other people are thinking about the same situation. The next is sort of how do we practice the right message about trying to build a multicultural sense of this work and not colorblindness. I don't know if anybody watches Bill Maher. I saw him last Friday night, and he was saying, my generation, the goal was color blindness, and that's what we're supposed to do. And now we moved away from that. Why did we ever move away from that goal? That was what we were supposed to get to as a country. And so that sense of, well, race doesn't matter. The differences don't matter. And not really a sense of celebration of the synergistic effects of all of us being together. It was part of why we brought together the initial working group of the collaborative of multicultural and minority members of STFM, and why, as was mentioned earlier, about why we want to have a diverse group. That there's something in the strength of us being different and being one, rather than sort of I'm not sure if it's a type 1 or type 2 error, that everybody's the same. So stereotyping is the one side, like, people are different, so different that they really aren't, we have no connection. And then color blindness is the other side of the error, which is we're all the same. And so why should that matter? I think individual group membership is not diagnostic, and to think more situational versus dispositional. So when we hear about things that have happened with our mentees, the things that they're experiencing, things that are happening in their context, things that we're reflecting on in our own, not to just group things and say like, well, this always happens because of this, but really get down to the very specifics. What's happening with you right now? What's happening with me? What's happening in your situation? How did that transpire? Let's figure out how systemic racism is playing out in this moment for you, and how can we work to address that? Again, not to generalize and pontificate, I think, based on, well, this person is like everybody else in their group. And then I think along with that is to challenge our own stereotypes. This is really deep work for me. It's very hard, it takes time. But again, one of the worst things I think that I face is that I don't know what I don't know. And if I don't know I have a stereotype, I'm not going to do anything about it. And so how can I put myself in situations where people hold a mirror up to me and say, you're thinking in this way, you're acting in this way, when I might not even think that I'm acting stereotypically. Okay, next. I don't think I'm driving. Okay, so we're going to go to a small group discussion next. And in part to talk about what our growing edges are. So when I was saying that this is really, this year, if it's anything like last year for me, and I think for people involved, people took a lot of effort to really think about who they were, what they were bringing to this work, where did they want to change, and how could they grow in order to help their mentees? What could they do differently? Where is their growing edge? A year wasn't enough for me last year, nor was the last 67 years enough. But one of my growing edges is jumping in to try and figure out what I can do to help. So I'll hear the problem that the mentee is presenting. I go, I know what to do. I've been through this. I've been around the block enough times. I can help you. Why don't you do X? And not to really engage in sort of deep listening and to figure out again, what is it that you're saying? What do you need? What is it that you want help with? Rather than I assume that what the help is that you need and move from that. And that happens in a split second for me. People just have to open their mouth and say 2 or 3 words, and I'm already working on a solution. I'm not even hearing the rest of what they're talking about. Right. So in the small groups, would like you to think about what is one of your growing edges that you want to think about this working on this year. And then what can you do to work on that growing edge? This is not a test. You're not going to be held accountable by any of us, just by the world. So it's just really a chance to think about that and talk about it. Can we go to the next slide for a moment, please? So how we're going to do this. So isn't people familiar or have done caucusing? Yes, no, no. Okay. So caucusing, it comes from an Algonquin word, kakasao, meaning counseling. It's a process that's been developed over the last several, I think, decades actually in education, and particularly around some of the application has been around working in areas of anti-oppression and anti-racism. And the concept is how to have groups that do share some things in common, and in particular, often race, in order to provide a place where people can talk and reflect and share ideas, where they might be able to say things that they would be hesitant to say in a group where there is a more of a diverse membership. And it serves somewhat to be a way to protect some of the Black and Indigenous and other people of color groups who are in with white members from hearing things that may be re-traumatizing. So it is a methodology in which any discussion occurs in which the groups are separate for the small group discussion. And so, for instance, what we will do is we will, those of us who identify as white will go into a small group and talk about our growing edges and what we would like to do to be able to work on that. And I think, I'm not sure whether there's going to be 1 or 2 other groups for the Black or Indigenous or other people of color, but those 2 groups will meet separately. This is not something that we say that this is the way the world should always operate. It's a tool. It's a way to allow people. I know again, I got thousands of growing edges. You can listen to them all day, but one of those is, I think, like, well, either I'm afraid to say something in a mixed group, so I'm going to be quiet, because if I say something, it might be offensive, or I'm going to virtue signal. I'm going to say the really cool, radical, anti-racist thing that people go like, oh yeah, he's like, he gets it. So, I mean, and I got all kind of ways that I can, but what it allows me to do is to not really reflect on myself, to not really allow myself to say things that I might say, and to be challenged by somebody else who I would listen to. I know in other times when different Black or Indigenous groups or people of color groups have been together, some of the Black groups have said, this is church for us. We just get a chance to sit and talk with each other. And it's often a focus on what's been the impact of being in a systemically racist environment. And last year was a lot about what was going on in our society, in addition to what was happening with people in their academic settings or their clinical settings. And that's no different this year, but that's where people felt like at least we can talk about this and not have to just be ourselves and not have to worry about what we say or how people are going to respond. In the white caucuses, it's more on our internalized superiority. What privileges have we had? How do we operate from those? So I can tell somebody in a mentee, like, you really got to get out, make sure you publish as much as possible. Get it 1 or 2 articles out a year. That's how you're going to get promoted. And not really be aware of what that does to them, how that reflects a supremacist infrastructure of academic medicine. So really to reflect on what are the ways in which how I say and what I do is so internalized, but adds to further oppression. So I'll stop for a second because since people haven't had a chance to really experience caucusing, I want to stop and see if you have questions about it or ideas or thoughts about what we're talking about, what we're going to do. Maybe we can go to the next slide really quickly because I think there's a part of that is there as well from what you just said, Dan. So just some general thoughts that we've learned over the year. And so is one, being aware of our own personal sensitivities and hurts, things that we've experienced ourselves where we felt that there were microaggressions or macroaggressions or experiences in our family that we hold on to, or things that we've felt like has happened to us that we have been hurt deeply, and how do we move from those? In many ways, they can be a source of strength, but they can also be a source, if they're blind to us, a place where we are trying again to fix something that isn't exactly what our mentee needs. And clearly then our own personal biases, to be able to be aware of those. And this is hard for me and deep work and takes a while. Secondly, to think about the life-size challenges, and some of you just talked about those. One is the rigors of the academic medicine, and this is a hard balancing act because people do need to be successful. They do need to feel like they have chosen a career, obviously, that they enjoy and they can be with for a long time and do make the difference that they brought the mission of their life into. At the same time, many people need a job and a paycheck and promotion, and that is based on certain criteria, and salary increases in that are based on certain criteria and institutions. So learning from what are the challenges that our individual mentees are facing around that? What are the organizational systems that they're involved in? How can we help them? And at the same time, not necessarily blindly be saying, you need to become like these white men who this system has been modeled after. And that's a hard balance to kind of strike, I think, for me. So that, and also understanding the multiple layers of challenges URM. Many people, and I think some of the people on this call even, have been put in places where they are the DEIA champion, vice dean, somewhere in their institution, they become the person now that everybody turns to and says, fix this and teach this and do this, without resources and without support, whether it's in a program or in the larger institution that they're in. And I think the whole thing of being aware of how often I, as a white person, will ask other people of color to teach me about where these things are in the curriculum. Build the curriculum, teach it, evaluate it, get it published yourself. Good luck. Thirdly, like, what are the relevant advocacy skills? And this gets to that key thing that Dan was talking about sponsorship. sometimes a phone call from us to kind of move things along to someone who knows how to get something done for this mentee, that a person who's the researcher in this area across the country that could really help our mentee out. Somebody who that has a pocket of money that they could apply for. So to not just sit there and only kind of be someone who listens and supports and gives ideas, but actually reaching out and doing some things that help work the system for them. As my mother said, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And she was right 70 years ago, and she's right today. Finally, then, as we know, addressing systemic racism in our world in the ways that we can and must, and then in our mentees' world, through the awareness that it's there, through our relationship with them, and helping them following their lead to what it is that they would like to see changed. I'm going to turn it back, I think, right?
Okay. Yeah, you could go to the next slide, Emily. So in summary, develop a comfort level with this language. You're not here to fix your mentees' racially driven hurts, but instead to be there for them, listen to them, be aware of our growing edges. And I think we all just had such a great conversation about that. It's so important as a mentor to know what you need to work on, and then to know that there's help out there and resources and so on. And Emily, if you just want to go to the last slide, just to show you this quote that I got from Michelle Obama. So she says, race and racism is a reality that so many of us grow up learning just to deal with. But if we ever hope to move past it, it can't just be on people of color to deal with it. It's up to all of us, Black, white, everyone, no matter how well-meaning we think we might be, to do the honest and comfortable work of rooting it out. So you can unshare the screen now, Emily. And I just want to say, you know, I'm so struck by Michelle Obama's words, and I'm struck by what we have created on this project, which is a group of people from all different backgrounds who are willing to come together and have very difficult conversations so that we can make positive changes, and so that we can have these conversations with our younger colleagues, and so that we can help to bring them up in academic medicine, and hopefully they're having conversations with their colleagues and just really spreading these important messages.